Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Online Autism Summit. I'm your host, Nick Fransen. We're here today with Amy Derksen. Amy will, I promise, have some wonderful things to talk to us about today. Amy, how are you?
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. And it's Derksen. It's okay. It's a weird spelling.
Now, Amy, you're a naturopath by trade. How did you get involved in treating autism?
How did this all happen? If you had asked me in medical school if I would be treating autism, I would not have thought that I'd be doing that. I really wasn't all that interested until I started working with kids. And, I was so lucky. I did my residency right out of naturopathic school with Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt, who has so much experience in working with this. But at the time, he was working primarily with Lyme disease and adults with neurological illnesses. And we had exposure to some of our first kids on the spectrum. And what we found is they really weren't that different than some of these chronically ill adults, except they responded so much faster. If things were bad, they were bad fast. But if things were better, they were better really fast. And so easy. We use a system of muscle testing called autonomic response testing. And, autistic children are like sponges. They're so giving with their energy, and it's so easy and really fun to test them. And what we were finding is we were able to really cut through things and learn a lot about health in general, both about kids and about some of our chronically ill adults. And, I was lucky enough that there were two very motivated parents. One at the time was a compounding pharmacist, another that who is very involved in the community. And they kind of decided at the time, you're going to be our next autism doctor, and introduced me to some amazing people. So I was very lucky from the beginning. I got exposed to people with so much more knowledge than I had, and it just paved the way of opening up this world of the gift of working with kids on the spectrum.
Now, Amy,
Yeah.
you're not like the usual doctor. You treat a lot of really chronic patients, not just in autism, but people with Lyme's and some of these real serious conditions. And you're not typically the first stop for these patients. Many of these patients have already seen many, many doctors, correct? How did this all happen?
Yeah, so it's tricky, so when we first started, and because I was working with Dr. Klinghardt, he also isn't a first stop sort of doctor. So we were attracting already some of the more complicated ones. And I think because of my affiliation with him, my name got known in some of these other circles. And it's tricky. The kids coming to me now have actually been to probably 20 or 30 doctors before they've come to me. And I would love to work with the newly diagnosed kids. Those are usually pretty easy. At least half of them, if not more, will get better with diet and some B12 and fish oil and some of these other basic things. But it's that other subset where I really think there's this immune system dysregulation. We see a ton of inflammation. These are the kids that get overreactive to everything. They've been on 2 years of antifungals, but the second they come off, their cheeks are red, they're toe walking, they're having all these reactions, or their siblings get sick, and they don't get sick with a sore throat, but they get OCD behaviors and are punching holes in the wall. And so those are the kids at this point that I'm attracting. And it's, there's a lot of question marks of what's going on. And I think things are getting a little bit more complicated. And I don't know if I'm just attracting more complicated kids, or really the environment is changing. So many things are changing. Vaccine schedules, all the cell phone emissions, quality of our food, and all the GMOs. I mean, there's so many factors that I don't think we can put our finger on any one thing. But I know our immune systems are confused. We see a lot more allergies. I've talked to teachers seeing, multiple kids in the class with peanut allergies. That was just unheard of before. We're seeing just all this environmental reactivity, these kids coming in with these huge allergic shiners, and just I'm seeing signs of adrenal deficiency, low immunoglobulins. Just it's kind of ridiculous how early it seems to be starting. And really that's what I think I've been spending the last several years trying to figure out what's going on, and I'm going to keep working on that my whole career, and hopefully at some point we'll figure it out.
Okay, Amy, why don't you talk to us a little bit about the microbes? This is always a big talk in the autism world. How big of a problem are these microbes?
Yeah, so the microbes are a huge piece, and there's a lot of them. So when we get into, we'll probably talk a little bit later about pandas, but that would be the most obvious immune dysregulation with children who are having reactions to organisms not looking like infection, but actually looking like these OCD behaviors or these violent behaviors. So we see huge connection with Lyme spirochetes and some of the co-infections. Mycoplasma, strep is notorious for that. But those pieces can be there. We also see this much bigger issue with parasites being a problem. The question mark I have is, are the parasites there because the immune system was dysregulated in the first place, or were they the trigger? And that's still my question with any of these bugs is, you know, a lot of these plants have done years and years of antimicrobial killing, whether it's prescription or natural, and we can never seem to get off that train. And sometimes we have to be more focused and aggressive. A lot of times I think we have to look at the size of the organism, and I think a lot of times parasites are under treated because it's so hard to find a positive parasite sample in a stool or anything else. And I've talked to a lot of parasitologists, and there's just no good way of doing that. But those are like little transport carriers for a lot of these smaller organisms. So especially when we see any of these cyclical sort of behaviors, those bugs are hiding somewhere. You know, there's been talk on biofilms, which I'm sure is part of this, but also other bugs could be part of that. And, you know, the heavy metal piece that everyone's known about is just attracting these organisms. It changes the pH, it changes the environment, it's attracting fungus, it's attracting a lot of these other things. So it's all interrelated.
Now, doctor,
Yeah.
the term pandas, this was a term that was talked about a few years ago, but not very prominently. And now we're starting to see this term pop up a lot more with these kids. Can you give some insight into what pandas is?
Right. I think that's true. And I've wondered, am I just exposed to more groups dealing with pandas? So am I just talking to people about that? Or is it really becoming more prominent? And I do think it's becoming more prominent. You know, at most of these autism conferences that are meant to kind of teach the basic practitioner how to approach autism, they're starting to have whole days devoted to that. And that's just not something that was ever taught even 10 years ago. And so we are really seeing this very dysregulated, abnormal immune response to things. It's very inflammatory. I mean, you can feel kids, they were calling it hypotonia, but you can feel their forehead and it feels squishy. You know, there's a reason kids, when they're acting out, are burying their head in the wall, posturing and doing all these things. They're in pain, and kids just don't know how to communicate that.
To the microbes for a second. What are some of the signs of microbes? What kind of behaviors do children exhibit that you would say this is typically a sign of parasites or yeast, possibly some sort of microbe? What sort of signs are we going to see?
Yeah, and maybe I would step back a little bit more than that before we even jump into pandas. Is this a microbial issue with my child? You know, because there's a lot of talk in there of nutrition and those things, and I think those things are very important. But when you've done those changes, you've done the diet changes, you've treated heavy metals, and your child's not getting better, the signs of microbes, so the aggressive behaviors, the chewing the shirt, you know, the kids that are chewing the collar off the shirt, that's usually Clostridia or some other GI bacteria. And it's very interesting. A lot of those kids don't have any abnormal stools. They don't have a bloated tummy, but you'll see this cycle that it may be there all the time, but it seems to come out of nowhere. And it's this aggressiveness that you know isn't your child. That's usually gut bacteria. Yeast will make this they're silly, and they're silly out of nowhere. And sometimes it'll come after they eat carbs, they eat sugar, or who knows what. Maybe you started antibiotics for an ear infection and they get weird. High-pitched tone to the voice, it changes. Tiptoe walking sometimes, the red cheeks, the hot red ears. Those are sort of yeasty signs that we tend to see. And that seems to be very common, and especially if they have heavy metal issues. Heavy metals definitely attract yeast or fungus. And so I think that's why antifungals have been used so often, and is that part of the protocol approaching autism really hasn't changed too much over the last several years. When we get into parasites, what I tend to see more often is we do see flares of behavior around the full and the new moon. It can look very much like bacteria, so it's more aggressive behavior, it's anxiety. And so I always think parasites with children who tend to be in this sort of vicious cycle. Every month, they're having some really rough days that we have no idea what the trigger is. The anxiety piece, the risky behaviors, aggressiveness, this huge phobia Disrupted sleep. A lot of times I see kids waking in the middle of the night with that. And that's typically a sign of parasites to me. And same thing, they may or may not have digestive issues. Um, but that one can be really huge. The viral stuff is usually your kid who gets sick pretty often. Anytime something goes around, they may not mount an effective fever. Like we always celebrate when kids get a fever, but they're always having that sniffly nose. They're always just a little bit sick. The glands are swollen and they never quite ever get over that. They look a little sick. They have a little bit of a gray appearance. It's also something to think of with a child who's had a suspected vaccine reaction, more likely to the MMR. And I'm not making a big stand on vaccines with this, but just if you've seen those behaviors, your child went in around that time and then they weren't the same after that, or they mounted a huge fever or and they've been abnormal since then. Sometimes we'll see these latent viruses that can become part of that. And, are viruses the trigger, or are they taking advantage of something else? Again, that's the big question mark, but that's where, we get into the high dose vitamin A protocols and why they're using prescription Valtrex, and there's a lot of natural things that can be very effective for that. When we get more into pandas or PANS, so pandas is the term, it's pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorder associated with strep. Sorry. Yeah.
Now, we used to see and hear a lot about these children that have explosive diarrhea, really bloated bellies, and just obvious gastrointestinal sort of symptoms. But I'm not seeing that sort of thing anymore. Patients aren't exhibiting these sort of drastic symptoms. Is it me, or are you seeing that as well?
I see some of that too. I used to see a lot more of the posturing, a lot of the bloated bellies and the posturing over the side of the couch. And I don't see that as much. And I don't know if it's because parents are more educated now and they're already jumping to, diet changes, possibly a CD diet or at least gluten and casein free, and jumping on probiotics, or if it's changed. I mean, I would say in my practice, I have a few that are still very severe and they actually get scoped and they do have colitis. And so you can see it. It's very obvious on a stool test. It's very obvious looking at them, but it's very obvious on a stool test. They'll have huge inflammatory markers that will show up, like on a Genova CDSA or a Metametrix GIFX. It would show up that way. You would see a lot of abnormal bacteria. The IgA levels, the secretory IgA, which is our gut antibody immune system, will be very upregulated in those kids. It is a very small subset that I'm seeing now, where it was sort of the norm of what I saw before. So it's interesting you're seeing that too.
If a parent brings a child in and they say, hey, look, he's not constipated, he poops regularly, he doesn't have a bloated belly, he doesn't seem to have any food allergies, he has no gut issues. This is a mistake, right?
That's a mistake. It's a mistake that I think a lot of us have made, and it takes some convincing when I'm talking to parents. Usually what I do in those is I would start, a urine organic acid test is so helpful. It's hard to collect poop. A stool test is great, but a urine test is sometimes even a little more useful in those, because you can get that information. Is there a lot of yeast coming out, like a lot of metabolites of the yeast? Are there some of those abnormal bacteria showing up? Are there some other markers, or is this truly like neurotransmitter imbalance or a nutritional deficiency? So something like that can give you a nice snapshot to know, okay, where do I focus treatments? But these comprehensive stool tests, which are not the tests that are typically run from like your LabCorp or your Quest, you have to do some of these specialty tests. They can be very, very effective at looking, well, maybe your child's not digesting food very well. Sometimes we'll see very high fecal fat levels, which can cause a lot of neurological symptoms, may not cause severe diarrhea. It's been shocking to me how bad some of the stool results look on kids without the obvious stool symptoms. And I think sometimes with parents, they think that, well, this must be normal kid poop. My child poops 5 times a day. That's a normal thing. That's not a normal thing, and a lot of these things can just play out into causing a lot of behavioral symptoms, more so than gut symptoms.
Let's go back to pandas for a second. Give me some details on this particular condition.
Yeah, so there is a subset in autism that a few of us seem to attract, and it's tricky. So it's pandas or it's PANS. PANS is the newer term, kind of referring to this autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorder linked with a variety of organisms, not just strep. The focus for so long was strep. A nice way to look at that is when behaviors come out of nowhere. So someone else in the house is sick, or it's, this time of year, it's fall. you've gone back to school. Okay, whoops, the teacher was out sick or a bunch of kids have been out sick. Your child's not sick with a fever, but man, they get weird. I mean, for lack of a better term, it's, they're not themselves. They have to wash their hands 20 times and do this very set routine, or it's a complete meltdown. When those behaviors tend to cycle around, you've got to be thinking, okay, there is this more inflammatory, odd immune reaction happening to these bugs that's not like your typical sickness. And we see that with strep. So a lot of times in labs, you may or may not have elevated like ASO titers or anti-DNase titers. When it comes up high, then okay, for sure, strep is a trigger. And a lot of times what we're finding is when we do strep swabs on the child or on the family members, is we will find that someone in the house may be a silent carrier. A lot of times we're finding the dog actually is a carrier of strep. And what happens in these sort of things is you're more sensitized to the strep species that you've been exposed to in the past. So you may not mount that response to an active strep infection that, someone on the airplane had. But if dad comes home and he's not sick, but he has this sort of latent strep that comes up for him, that you get very weird every time dad comes home from his business trips. And so what we're doing with some of these families is we're actually getting them a whole box of rapid strep kits. They swab the throat, but also swab the teeth. It's been interesting. I've seen with some of them, these are children that tend to do better on antibiotics, but the second you come off, they're a mess. And it was interesting. I had a family recently with 2 children, both on antibiotics for over 2 years. We swabbed the teeth, strep positive, rapid strep positive, even after that. And these are antibiotics that should be killing that off. And so the approach to treatment then would be different. You would do more of like a chlorhexidine or some focused dental rinse to get that off. You'd be sterilizing the toothbrush, treating the dog if the dog is the carrier. So I tend to swab everyone's throat, then teeth, just make sure in the middle of a flare, especially if there's multiple siblings having problems, who's the carrier, and let's treat them even if they're not showing an active infection, because that child will not get better unless they do. Where it gets trickier is when it's not strep. So when it's PANS, then it's this mystery. What is the trigger? And I find that almost anything can be the trigger. Molds can be the trigger. Mycoplasma, you can run viral titers to see, are those mycoplasma antibodies sky high, which if they are, then that could be part of it. But the Lyme organisms are definitely a big piece. And so I think one reason why people end up coming here after they've been to so many places is because we do sort of bridge the gap. Antibiotics and some of the prescriptions, I think, have their limitations because they're so narrow in their focus. They work great when they work, but when it's this mystery, like, are you reacting to everything? I think that's where some of the herbal protocols do a lot better because they're a little more broad spectrum to sort of, okay, let's hit a reset button and knock some of these other things down.
Our toolbox. What do you see working with these children these days? What is it that you find, wow, this supplement or this particular method is really working?
Yeah, no, and it's a great question. My toolbox probably changes a little bit, but there's some standards that have always been in my toolbox. I always think we need to do high doses of some sort of omega-3. You really want to be looking for close to 3,000 milligrams a day to have that true anti-inflammatory effect. I still am a fan of Dr. Neubrander's protocol for the methyl B12 subcutaneous injections. I have really played a lot with like the sublinguals and those things that I can start with, but I haven't seen the wows as much as I have with the injections. Amazing. I mean, we get speech, you dump heavy metals. I've had kids, we've never had to chelate them. We just do the B12. It's like it gets everything working. So those pieces are some of the common ones. Dietary, of course, elimination of gluten, ideally elimination of dairy. If they're having a lot of fungal symptoms, bug symptoms, any of those microbe sort of things, then more of an SCD diet absolutely makes sense. It's hard. It's so much easier as they're younger. So I would say if you're debating doing it, start it now. Do not wait until they're 8 or 9 or 10 and they're very aware of the differences between what they're eating and what their friends are eating. It's so much easier when they're younger. Other things that are really working. So when it comes to microbes, I do a lot of parasite prescriptions. So I'm a huge fan of doing a parasite parade, was kind of a term that they were using in the DAN community a a while ago, but where we do one thing followed by another by another. And so literally they're on antiparasitics for probably close to 2 or 3 months. So mebendazole, which is Vermox, which is no longer available at regular pharmacies. We have to have compounded now, unfortunately, but it's relatively inexpensive at the compounders. Biltricide is great. Albendazole, crosses that blood-brain barrier. So for a lot of the psychiatric issues, so that one I tend to use a lot of. Alinea is fantastic, expensive, often not covered by insurance. And that's the tricky thing with the antiparasitics, is the doses that we seem to need are kind of outside the standard. So insurance may cover uphill, because that's sort of standard in care in the US of like, oh, you give a single dose. This isn't a single dose sort of thing. It really is, you have to catch the life cycle of these little stinkers. So, every 2 to 3 weeks, you want to at least be pulsing something. And I find it's better if you can just have them continuously on something. So we've used there's other pharmacies, we can get creative. So if someone needs some ideas for that, they definitely can reach out to my office and we can help to give them some ideas.
How long do some of these children have to go on this parasite protocol? Are we talking 3 months, one cycle, or can this go on for a number of months?
After that depends. Yeah, it depends. I'm sorry, I talked over you. So depends on the severity of the symptoms they were having. If they were having crazy insomnia and punching holes in the wall, most likely, and especially if they're older, if they're younger, that usually is enough. If they're under 5, that often is enough. If they are over 10, this is a long process. We're probably looking at a couple years of at least pulsing something. So I would tend to start it off with 2 to 3 months, depending on the case. And again, I muscle test. So, I'm always checking in on that. But I would do a rotation of many of the prescriptions. I would follow that up then with every new and full moon. I would pulse something. And maybe it's an herbal protocol. So maybe it's like PCHF Botanifuge is fantastic. There's a product called Humaworm that's pretty good. But I love Botanifuge. It's been one of my favorites. I also find that artemisinin can be helpful. There's some crossover that would work for Lyme and Babesia. That sometimes has been really great. And like oregano or probiotic, there's a few, some of these combination herbal protocols can be really good. Research Nutritionals makes microbinate that maybe could do it. I don't know. I'm playing with that one a little bit. But some of those herbal things. But again, we'd want to pulse around the full and new moon. That I would tend to start at least a day before, if not 2 days before, span the day of the full or new moon and go at least a day after. So we're going to get these little pulses in. Sometimes what I've done is I do a continuous protocol for a few more months with something natural just to make sure. We've had really good luck if kids will do something that tastes a little bit like pepper. There's a company called Kauai Herbals, like Kauai, like the island in Hawaii, and they make a papaya black seed blend that is fantastic. It's not absorbed systemically, but it kills these things off, and I don't see a lot of die-off symptoms. It helps the bowels move, so they, take, a spoonful of that, especially around those moon cycles, and it seems to work very, very well. I also find homeopathy, once they've done this sort of killing the antimicrobial intense piece, homeopathy with some of these nosodes can be fantastic. So some of these combination blends that maybe Mountain State Health products come out with, or PCHF, can be very good. Vermox or Amebatox or King Paraclance, those can be very helpful in certain situations. And again, I think it's retraining that immune response to those things. The other thing to keep in mind when you're doing these parasite protocols is what's inside the parasites. So when you kill them off, you are shaking the hornet's nest. Parasites are big. What's inside there? There's heavy metals inside there. There's all kinds of toxins. There's probably bacteria. So you really have to watch, and you at minimum need to have some sort of binder going. When you start these protocols, you are going to have a disaster area.
What sort of symptoms should I be aware of when we take these parasite medicines? I mean, what kind of symptoms is my child going to exhibit? Are they going to go crazy? Crying spells, meltdowns? What should I expect?
Yeah, so you need to be careful. And if you need to be careful. If your doctor is not used to working with this, or you don't have a lot of experience with this, do know when you start to treat parasites, it's very unexpected what's going to happen. It may be amazing. Sometimes it's immediately amazing. Allergies get better. Behaviors are immediately better. When it's not amazing, it can be really bad. And what we can see is, as you're killing off parasites, we can have a big histamine release. And so some kids get a lot of, oh my gosh, these very excitatory sort of behaviors. And what you'll notice is as it goes on, it gets worse, 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 worse. Eventually it will get better. But I think, a lot of times what I will do is I just start them on support from the beginning. So you want a binder to bind up the toxins, the heavy metals and any of that kind of stuff that's going on. So you could do something like BioPure Zeobind is fantastic for that. It just mixes into water. It's just a zeolite extract. You could do some chlorella if you want to, if they tolerate chlorella. Activated charcoal or bentonite work fantastic as long as they don't get constipated. But you need to make sure something is mopping that up. You want to take that separate from the antiparasitics. But then I usually do some sort of antihistamine, maybe Claritin or Zyrtec or Benadryl in the evening if they're having behaviors. So, I would look at the history, see do they have high eosinophils, which you'll usually see on a blood count. If you see those high eosinophils and your child's not having a lot of allergies, you've got to be thinking parasites. And that's probably the child that their rescue for bad behaviors will be those antihistamines. And if you don't want to do something like that, you could do like high doses of vitamin C, which again helps flush the system out, but it also acts as a natural antihistamine. So we'd be looking at, 1,000 milligrams multiple times a day. Or you could look at quercetin, which also reduces a lot of food reactions.
Kind of new therapy up there that I haven't heard a lot about. I think it's called low-dose antigen therapy, and this has a really unique approach that I'm really not seeing many other practitioners use. Can you describe this therapy to us?
I'm seeing some very good results with that. So, I've been suspecting the kind of immune dysregulation piece for years now. And, I personally have Hashimoto's, so I have an autoimmune thyroid condition. So I'm always on the hunt of I had a lot of allergies as a kid. I want to know how do I get myself clean? And then how do I work with a lot of these kids? Because it's always been a huge question mark for me. The kids that have been on years of antifungals that get so funny in their symptoms within a day or 2 days of coming off them. And there's no way that the candida load has gone up in just the 1 or 2 days. So I know it's almost like an allergy to the bugs. And so there's something called low-dose antigen therapy, or LDA. And if you're interested in learning more about that, training is offered through the American Academy of Environmental Medicine. And so you can always reach out to them to find out someone who's doing that. But it is all about promoting immune tolerance. So it's essentially the next generation of allergy desensitization, where it takes, unlike traditional allergy shots that start with, you do your skin scratch testing and you find what you're reactive to, and you're working up your dose basically to flood the body to a point that it can't react anymore. This is the opposite. It's taking these very, very teeny tiny doses of inactivated proteins of environmental triggers or foods, and it's activating it with an enzyme, and you do it once every 7 weeks. You don't do pre-testing. You're treating a lot of organisms at once. And the concept is if it wasn't an organism that's causing a problem, it won't be a problem to just basically get desensitized to it. But what we're seeing is after 3 to 6 rounds, a lot less overall reactivity. So it really is great for foods. The food treatment is for 300 of the most common food triggers. The inhalants is great. 300 environmental inhalants, including molds. Something I've seen that's been amazing is, with the adults that I work with, those who've been very sensitive to the point that they can't go into a church or a library because of their mold sensitivities, they've been able to go into those places without reacting. I've noticed with myself when I've done it, my thyroid shrank within a couple hours. My history was always with molds. And I've been off allergy medicine for months now. It's amazing. So I've really seen if we can reduce the overall load, what you find is your child is more tolerant in general. So then you can actually go after some of these other bugs. And there is a newer concept of LDI, which is low-dose immunotherapy, that is spoken about a lot by Dr. Ty Vincent. So if you wanted to look into that, I would just look into what he's doing, but where that's targeting some of these treatments against specific organisms, whether that's some of the fungal elements or the Lyme and co-infections and some of those things. So I think there's a lot of, strep is a big one that we're doing with some of our pandas kids. So I think it has a lot of potential to retrain the T regulator lymphocytes So the 7-week thing is basically you're allowing the span of the white blood cell and those newly kind of trained T regulator cells to be ready to kind of just be okay with some of these bugs, that they don't have to mount this crazy response to just the single little organisms that are floating around.
Are these bugs really just creating a sort of hyperimmune response similar to an autoimmune response
Right.
that is just driving the body crazy?
Right. Because what we find is a lot of these microbes cause that same sort of inflammatory response. And, and that's been one of the question marks in the world of Lyme, is how come some people have been on IV antibiotics for, gosh, I've had people who've shown up here, been on it for 10 years, and they're still sick. There's no way that the bugs are still surviving at that point, but it's the immune system response to it. The immune system is so upregulated that as soon as it sees one little organism, it goes into that pain syndrome. And so it's not that we don't treat the bugs. You have to still get the load down, but how do we get the body to chill out? And I always think of it like, think of it like herpes. So maybe you had a bad cold sore when you were younger, but you haven't had an outbreak since then. It's because your immune system has tolerance to that. It's formed those long-term IgGs. It's the organism's there, but you don't always have to be having an active sore. And it's sort of the same concept. We can live in harmony with some of these bugs. We're full of bugs. We are more bugs than we are us. So I think we need to start to live in harmony, kill off those that are really kind of taking over everything, get some balance back. But I think there's a lot of potential. And so far what I'm seeing with that is I'm very pleased and excited about how that is changing the nature of my practice.
What type of improvements are you seeing with this low-dose antigen therapy?
Yeah, so I've definitely seen that overall reactivity reducing for people. So, the kids that you can't do anything with, they go to school and they come back and they've reacted to something in the air, or there was a birthday party and they ate something and now their behaviors are so abnormal. It has been calming that down. So it makes it so it's a little more predictable. I've definitely seen it improving just the regular seasonal environmental allergies. They're doing a lot of work on working with general autoimmunity, and I think a lot of the subpopulation of kids on the spectrum is a form of autoimmunity. It's this sort of self-reactive, mounting this abnormal response. And so I have seen it calm that down. I've seen some amazing things with treating strep with this form of treatment in the middle of a pandas flare. So we give a treatment for that, and it, like, within hours can calm down the flare. I mean, the other thing to think of that can work in a similar way during those sort of flares are really high potency homeopathics, like a 1M potency of strep or even a 10M can also calm that down. Again, it's that we're training that immune system response.
Now the big question, one we always have to ask, what do you see working for speech?
The speech is such a tough one, right?
It's a constant problem for many of us. Give us some ideas.
So I haven't clearly seen it help with speech. I'm in my infancy of working with it. I've only been working with it for the last year, and I've only been working with kids with it for probably the past 6 months because I don't start any treatments with kids. I do it with my more sensitive adults because I want feedback. I'm not willing to use kids as guinea pigs in this one. I haven't seen it have the speech happen. I mean, the wows I've seen with speech, definitely the B12 shots. I've seen speech come with that. Chelation, I've seen speech come with that. High dose, sometimes phosphatidylcholine, I have seen speech come with that. So this whole liposomal push has been helpful for that, where we're combining some of these antimicrobials with phosphatidylcholine to make them more available to the nervous system. I have seen some breakthroughs with that. I think there's potentials, and it's tough. The speech one is tough. It's another subset of kids that just don't get speech. And it's a little different for all of them. Yeah, I wish I had the magic bullet for that one. I don't yet. We're working, and every child who's recovered speech-wise, it's been so different. So they talk about very high doses of vitamin E, and I know Dr. Klinghart's been using this, 2,000 to 3,000 IUs, especially in acute sort of episodes, so maybe 1 or 2 times a week, these high doses. That has been touted to help with speech. Yeah. It's difficult. It is.
Also doing another therapy up there, low-dose immune therapy of some sorts. I've heard you discuss this just minorly. Are you seeing success with this as well? And is it really used to enhance the immune system?
Yes, it's a similar concept, but it's more same sort of thing. We're trying to promote that immune tolerance to the basically to the immune system against these organisms. And we definitely find that the Lyme and the co-infections, your Bartonella, your Babesia, Rickettsia, that these can be very inflammatory. They tend to cause that sort of, you're caught in this vicious cycle. You get a lot of head symptoms, headaches, migrating pains. Oh my gosh, so many abnormal behaviors. And that has been amazing. I haven't done a lot of that with children. I've definitely done a lot of that with my adults at this point because it's very hard to find the right dose because it's such an inflammatory organism. And so that's really in its infancy. Working with Candida, working with strep, those are a little more known. Kids do great with that. Do really great with that. They're doing some exploring with Clostridia. I've seen some nice things. I think it's just about finding the right dose and the right timing. Yeah.
Okay.
But there's potential. I would say look into it, especially if your child is on the pandas or PANS, portion of the spectrum. If they're always getting sick, if they have a lot of obvious allergies, or you have a strong family history of allergies, mom and dad both have a lot of allergies, or mom has autoimmunity, I would definitely look into that. Yeah.
So we always know there's a gut-brain connection in autism.
Okay.
Tell me, what do you use to help treat the brain in some of this? I know there's some great remedies out there. What's working for you?
Yeah, so I mean that's always a big thing. It's like, okay, we know all these things are triggering it, but what do we do from here to our next visit to get your child feeling better and behaving better? So I'm a huge fan of curcumin, which, Enhanza is one product that's out there, but there's many other curcumin products available. And Enhanza is easy if your child's not swallowing pills because it doesn't have much of a taste. But if they're doing pills, I really like some of these more liposomal versions of that. Thorne makes a nice one. CuraPro is excellent. So if they can swallow pills, those are great. So those are nervous system anti-inflammatories. Dosing, if you can do it, and if you're in trouble, is 2 twice a day, even for the little ones. It's a lot to get in them, but it can really make a big difference. High doses of omega-3 oils are always effective, and it's really to make sure you're doing enough. So again, it's closer to 3,000 milligrams a day, even for a small child. And don't be afraid that on the bottle it says, oh, if you're such and such age, you can't do more than, a teaspoon of this sugary stuff. No. It's not the case. You're really wanting close to that. And if they're getting loose stools or anything like that, then you'll just have to divide up the doses. But there really is a point that you just have to get enough. I'm looking, sorry, if I'm looking off to the side, I'm looking over at my test kits of like what's really working. Phosphatidylcholine alone can be very helpful. So it's food for the brain and food for those, that lipid bilayer, so our cell membranes. And so, that can come, most of them are soy-based, so something to keep in mind. I would say if your child has a soy allergy, soy lecithin, which is what the phosphocholine is from, has those proteins stripped out. So it's not going to be as much of an allergen. Though if you're wanting maybe a better quality product, then look for the sunflower oil-based products. So Seeking Health makes a nice sunflower-based phosphatidylcholine, but there are other brands out there to do that. So you're looking at about 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams a day. You want to divide these doses. They do upset the tummy a little bit. Other things that have really helped, quercetin I love. So quercetin can be great, especially for kids with a lot of obvious food reactions, is that you can dose that before meals, which will help to reduce their food reactions. Quercetin is often mixed with bromelain. If you're having to open up capsules to have your child take them that way, I wouldn't have bromelain in there. It can be a little irritating to the mouth and just tastes really bad. So I would stick to either a straight quercetin or a quercetin nettle mix, but probably just a straight quercetin. So that helps especially for this head congestion and environmental allergies and some food reactions. Prescription-wise, I use a lot of ketotifen. So ketotifen comes from a compounding pharmacy and really great for children with colitis or that elevated IgA response and some of those things, because you have to consider 80% of our neurotransmitters come from our gut, but also gut inflammation is going to trigger full body inflammation. Think of your patient with celiac disease who can't do gluten. They hurt everywhere. but it probably took them a few years to figure out that it's coming from their gut, because they weren't necessarily having gut issues. They were just having headaches and fatigue, and they were diagnosed with fibromyalgia. Same sort of thing. So ketotifen can be great. I think of it like Benadryl for the gut, except it's more healing. And so they think if you do it for at least 6 months, that it can really reset that active immune colitis. And so you would talk to your compounding pharmacies. Ideally, you're working up to 1 milligram 3 times a day. You take it before meals and then again at bedtime. Because it can make you tired, you often start with just the bedtime dose and then sort of work your way up. And if your child's too groggy, then maybe they only do a 0.5 milligram once a day. That's okay. But that one can be very good. And you can also get that. One thing that I found is helpful is over-the-counter eye drops. There's a brand called Alloway, and there are a few other brands out there as well, but I've used Alloway. The active ingredient is ketotifen. And so one trick I learned from an allergist that I talked to at one of these autism conferences is that you put a drop in each eye and a drop up each nostril. Doesn't hurt at all. It's you do that twice a day, and it really reduces a lot of environmental triggers, because you've got to think these are mucous membranes just like our gut. So if we can help our defenses here, it reduces that overall reactivity. And I've been able to get kids less reactive to foods, even just with doing the drops here. It's kind of amazing. It's all about the total load. So that's really great, especially let's say you're going to a school that you think there's something at the school that's triggering your child. That can be really helpful. You put that in their eyes and nose before they go. Other anti-inflammatories and things that have worked. What's really working? Chelation is always helpful for the brain. Oh, one thing we really like is liposomal melatonin. So again, we're getting back to the liposomal piece. So melatonin you probably have thought about for sleep, but what many people don't think of is melatonin is a fantastic brain antioxidant. There were studies done, back in the time when I was in school, so 15 years ago, doing these high doses for Parkinson's and MS and having very good results. And so we find there's some liposomal sprays, like Da Vinci Labs makes a nice one, or there's a product called Oncotonin that's a capsule that's really high dose. And these higher doses, especially made as a liposomal, get right into the brain and they can really calm things down. I've also seen CoQ10 really helpful if you do a high enough dose. Sometimes I've been going as high as 400 milligrams a day. And it's really good, like if you've done some genetic testing or you've done genetic testing on yourself, and just oxidative stress is high, you have a lot of SOD issues, maybe a lot of NOS issues, then that's where, your melatonin and your CoQ10 might come into play. And so it's just another rescue thing to think of.
We used to hear a lot about the metals. We used to hear a lot about the mercury and the lead and the aluminum and some of these different metals. We don't hear about that as much anymore. Maybe people have tried it, I'm not sure. But tell me a little bit about chelation. Are you using chelation? What do you see as working?
So the biggest thing with chelation is it's always a question mark, where are the metals coming from? Because I've had some kids with really high metal loads where mom doesn't have amalgams, wasn't any abnormal exposure. I do think some of the metals are probably coming from some of the methylation issues, that there's been some compromised concerns passing on through generations. And so they're not clearing toxins. We're exposed to heavy metals all the time in our environment and our food. And if we're not able to clear those, our loads will get pretty high pretty quickly. Some kids have done well with IV chelation. I don't do IV chelation. I find, sometimes that big hit of trying to get things out and then recover, I find it can redeposit a little bit more, and I'm seeing more symptoms. Not to say, if it's a man who's trying to treat atherosclerosis, of course I'm doing IV chelation with EDTA. That makes sense. But for kids, I find often the slow and steady way is more the way to go, or to do these pulses. I give a lot of credit actually to Andy Cutler and his concept of, doing at least the 3 days in a row, where you look at basically the half-life of some of these chelators. So, with DMPS, you're dosing it every 8 hours. DMSA, you're dosing every 6 hours, to make sure you're not redistributing some of these heavy metals. And I think that's always the biggest risk to keep in mind with any sort of chelation is, the body's always trying to preserve itself. So yeah, there's heavy metals there. They're probably stored in the bones, stored in the tissues. They're at the safest place right now for the body to have them. So when you're going in and putting a chelator, basically means you're giving something that's trying to grab those metals and take them out. But if you're not doing enough or you're not doing it in a safe way, you can grab it and then whoops, it lets go before you've eliminated that. You haven't urinated it out. You pooped it out. Where's it going to deposit? And can that cause more symptoms? And that's where those parents who've had bad experiences, that's where they found it happened. So number one, enough hydration, make sure your kid is pooping, and if they're not, you're not going to touch chelation. I would tend to start slow. So I like binders. I love like some of my simple things. Your charcoal, your Zeobind is amazing if you're doing it often. I really like, there's a product by Mountain State Health Products or Quicksilver called Intestinal Metal Detox, which is a large silicone molecule with 40 sulfhydryl groups. So very strong chelator, but it stays inside the gut. So you're not risking that remobilization or redistribution. You're just catching what the gallbladder have already been trying to eliminate. And I find it so well tolerated. And really is a nice way to get started on that. And, one thing I know that Dr. Klinghardt and I were also finding is when people were doing that, BioPure has a similar product called Metal Sweep. So when they're taking something like that regularly, they're doing so much better with your DMSA or your DMPS, because I think we're not getting as much of the redistribution. Suppositories are great, not necessarily great for the parent or the child, but if they're young enough, it's not a big deal. They're really not that painful. It's not that invasive. I usually do 3 days in a row each week. So EDTA can be great if you're going after lead. I like DMPS. I'm a huge fan of DMPS. Great antioxidant. It's very specific for the mercury. You would have to have that one compounded. DMSA suppositories are good. I do find a little bit of yeast issues flaring with that, but it can be good. It has a lot of crossover for both the mercury and the lead. A big thing also to consider heavy metal-wise is aluminum. Most of these pesticides, so there's so much talk on the glyphosate and everything else. So we have to go after the aluminum. And so, we've been exploring a lot what to do about that. And the zeolites can be helpful for that, getting enough kind of minerals and some other things in the body. And I'm sure Dr. Klinghardt had talked about that quite a bit. He's very passionate about that now. So watch his lecture. Talked about that. What else am I using? A lot. Minerals. Have to replenish minerals. I mean, don't forget to do that. B12 and really supporting methylation, I think, is a big piece. We've got to get the detox cycle working. And then if they possibly have a cryptopyrroluria issue, so an issue with zinc and B6, there is a urine test that we can look for that, but typically just look at your child. Do they have the healing fingernails or the little white spots there? Do they have sort of that see-through skin where you can see all the little veins on their chest or on their cheeks? Most likely they have a zinc deficiency. There's an easy way, like many naturopaths will do this zinc tally test, where you'll swish 2 teaspoons of zinc around in the mouth. And if you can't taste it, you're zinc deficient. Or you can run labs on your child and look at, okay, on a basic chemistry panel, is their alkaline phosphatase below 70, but especially is it below 40? If they are, they're zinc deficient. So doing enough zinc, I'm doing 30 to 60 milligrams of zinc with kids, along with activated B6 as P5P, can really help, supports folate cycle, methionine cycle. It supports the way for these toxins to get out, because all your B12s and your folates aren't going to work if you're deficient in your zinc and B6, because every one of those gene steps is dependent on that. So sometimes you have to look at really the more basic things. I mean, the chelators are there, and I'm sure there's been a lot of talk on that. So I don't have to go into those too much, but slow and steady.
Hey, Dr. Amy, tell us, how does somebody get a hold of you if they say, I really want to take my child to see her, she knows what she's talking about? Where can we get in contact with you?
Yeah, so my office name is Holistic Healing Arts, and I'm in Edmonds, Washington, which is just north of Seattle. So right now I'm not taking new patients, but I will be taking kids again probably in the new year. We're just kind of at that sort of shuttle. I have some other great practitioners that are working here who were working with Dr. Klinghardt for several years. So you definitely would be in good hands. Dr. Catherine Dahlgren, Dr. Michelle Grindstaff, Andriana Rainville, all fantastic practitioners in my office who are ready to take on new patients and who incorporate the system of muscle testing that he's taught us, which takes some of the guesswork out. So, know that that's a part of what we do. So we have a website. It is holistichealingarts.org. So HOLISTIC is how you spell holistic. So holistichealingarts.org. And so you can find out about us there and contact the office.
Amy, this has been a fantastic interview, just full of some of the best stuff that you've got, I imagine, and it should help a ton of people. Thanks so much for being with us today.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for doing this.